So welcome everyone to our latest edition of our speaker series as part of the Decade of Distinction. I'm Rabbi Miller, and it is a delight to have all of you joining us as we have this wonderful treat today for all of you. The Scholar Series, which has been brought to us by the Kraus family, an adaptation of our usual Scholar in Residence program to now being a Scholar Series for this year. We are grateful to Henry Kraus and Shirley Kraus of blessed memory for making Scholar Series possible this year. As well, we are delighted for those who helped bring our Scholar Series to life. Thank you to our hosts for today, Dr. Michael Rubner, Josh and Esther Garfield, and of course to our special guest, Rabbi Norman Cohen. I am delighted to have Rabbi Cohen here with us today. We have a long connection to each other, and when it came time to selecting people to be a part of our Scholar Series, Rabbi Cohen was one of the first people who came to mind for me as someone who was so influential in my own studies, in my rabbinate, and the journey that I have been on. Now, we could start in many places. We could talk about Rabbi Cohen as a fantastic professor of Midrash, and I took multiple courses from him over my time at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, the Reform Seminary, where he has been professor for many years. We could talk about my work with him as my thesis advisor, as I wrote my thesis, Blunting the Teeth of the Next Generation, about intergenerational punishment and sin and transgression. We could talk about Rabbi Cohen as having been my congregant at Temple Bethel of Northern Westchester when I was an associate rabbi, or we could start with our shared passion for basketball and who might make the March Madness run this year, as Rabbi Cohen and I often are talking about basketball, also having played basketball against each other on the court. Let me tell you, the man boxes out like you wouldn't believe. But today, it is just my delight to be able to share with you and bring to you one of my favorite teachers. Rabbi Norman Cohen is going to enlighten us and inspire us today with his Torah. Rabbi Cohen, welcome to our Scholar Series.
Shalom to all. I'm just very, very pleased to be here at Temple Shalom. I'm so grateful to you, Rabbi Miller, for your kind invitation to be part of this wonderful, wonderful series. Grateful to all who had a hand in this, Rabbi Boxman in particular, who I've spoken to. I'm just thrilled to be here to celebrate this 10th anniversary of both you, Rabbi Miller, and Cantor Azu, two very, very special former students at the Hebrew Union College in New York. It really is a pleasure for me to be here and to be here with friends that we've met at the congregation when we've been down in Naples. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me to share one of my great passions in life, and that is this florid world of rabbinic interpretation of the Bible called Midrash. It's the process by which the rabbis, by immersing themselves in the biblical text, were able to garner meaning for their lives and their life situations, and by extension, so too can we. I would offer you to come along with me on this journey and see how this process of Midrash can help us to find out who we are and who we aspire to be. And we're going to see very, very quickly that as we delve into these biblical texts filtered through the prism of Midrash, we'll see how the rabbis responded to the obligation to reach out to other human beings outside of their world and to embrace them in terms of what they need. They were very sensitive to the whole issue of social justice, and these texts are just beautifully shaped as examples of what we must do ourselves in terms of our own life situations. By reading the biblical text through the prism of Midrash, we therefore can uncover the Kedusha, the holiness latent in the text. So to remind ourselves of that, I always start with the blessing to study Torah. So I say, Baruch Ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'sivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise that power in the universe that impels us to immerse ourselves in words of Torah and take them into our hearts and our minds and allow them to touch us and to sustain us. So I ask you to come along with me. And we're immediately going to start with a text, probably a text that you remember from Exodus chapter 2, when Moses is ensconced in Pharaoh's palace. but yet we'll see he's going to go out and reach out to his brothers and sisters, the Israelites. So if Rabbi Miller, you could post the text.
Certainly, I'll post a text. Just a reminder for those who saw the email this afternoon, we also sent you a link to the text if you want to view it or you've printed it out. I'll be doing a screen share, and know that throughout this, I know Rabbi Cohen loves interaction. So if you want to post questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the webinar, I'll be monitoring that frequently to see if you have questions. We can have interactions and back and forth dialogue as we study the text.
Great, very good. Wonderful, perfect. Thanks, Rabbi Miller. So as you can see, if you take a look at verse 11, it says, Vayigdal Moshe, Moses grew up, Vayetze el Echav, and he went out to his brothers and sisters. The word Vayetze is very powerful here. Moses, ensconced in a very privileged upbringing, ensconced in his world of comfort. Nevertheless, he's willing to go out and engage with his brothers and sisters who are suffering under slavery. And I submit to you that that too is our challenge. We who live in places of comfort, ensconced in our own comfortable worlds, we too are challenged to go out and relate to people outside of ourselves who have needs that ultimately we can help in terms of meeting. So Moses goes out to his brothers and sisters, and then we get for the first time, one of three, the word vayar. Vayar from the Hebrew word ro'eh, which means to see. And ro'eh in the biblical sense, through the prism of the rabbis, doesn't simply mean to see perfunctorily. It means to experience on the deepest levels. Moses goes out and vayar et echav. He sees his brothers and sisters. He relates to them. He understands the pain that they are going through. And then it goes on to say, Vayar besivlotam. He witnessed their suffering and all of that which was placed upon them. And it's an extraordinary, unique phrasing. We expect it to use a kind of an accusative particle. It should say, Vayar et sivlotam, for those of you who know some Hebrew. But it says, Vayar be sivlotam. He sees literally, ba means in their pain. He experiences their pain on the deepest level. He's able to share their pain with them in a very, very direct way. So Moses goes out and sees the pain of his people, if you will. And then it goes on to say one more Vayar. Vayar ish misri makeh ish ivri me'echav. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite slave. And then the word in Hebrew added on, me'echav, one of his brothers and sisters. Again, we see the depth of feeling on Moses' part, even though he himself hasn't experienced what the people have experienced. The depth of feeling on Moses' part in terms of what they're experiencing. He wants to make it better for them. And then comes a second Vayetze. He goes out again. Vayetze beyom hasheni. He goes out a second time. V'hine shnei anashim ivrim. He sees two Israelites fighting, if you will. Vayomer l'rasha. And he says to the one who seems to be the perpetrator, what are you doing? Calling him out on it. And here's Moses, if we think about the moment in the text, just to go back for a second. What has he experienced? He's experienced the taskmaster beating an Israelite. He's raised up and he's killed the taskmaster. But nevertheless, he's not afraid to go out again. Vayetze, Bayom Hasheni, and he sees these two Israelites fighting. And he's not afraid to call out the perpetrator of what's happening here, to call him on it. Moses is not afraid to confront the powers outside that ultimately impact on our lives. And that is the challenge that we all feel in a very, very direct way. His impulse to come out supersedes all of the potential fear that Moses experiences about going out and confronting the taskmaster or someone seeing him. And as a result of all of that, he would be reticent. We understand that Moses is the person. Moses is the ish here. He's the person who is willing to see his brothers and sisters. And it's reminiscent of a passage in Pirkei Avot. It says, Bakom she'ein ish, in a place where there's no human being, hishtadel liot ish. You have to attempt to be that person. Here, Moses is the ish, who's unafraid to go out, irrespective of what he has to face, and be able to see this person with a moral compass that is able to respond to his brothers and sisters. Such a powerful text, only in 3 lines, that sets up our entire session on social action. And I would submit to you that, in fact, it gives us the 3 basic early steps about our commitment and our responsibility vis-a-vis other people. First, that we have to open our eyes and see the injustice around us, to really see it and respond to it. Number 2, we have to empathize with the people who are suffering. And the text clearly underscores Moses' empathy for his brothers and sisters, irrespective of his life in the palace. And thirdly, we have to be able to put aside that place of comfort, put aside all the things that we do, and somehow find a way to respond to people's needs outside of ourselves. So it's a good start to our passage today. But I want you to do a little work now. I'm going to ask Rabbi Miller to put up passage number 2, which is a commentary on our passage. It's from Shemot Rabbah. Shemot is Exodus. It's an 11th, 12th century compilation on the book of Exodus. And it spells out some of the details that we've just read. So I want you to take a look at it, take 2 or 3 minutes, read the text, and I want you to share with me, and you can do that as Rabbi Miller indicated on the questions and answers. Share with me what you think this passage in the Midrash adds to our understanding and the importance of the biblical passage itself. So take a couple of minutes, look at the text, and then I want you to respond so that we can talk a little bit back and forth to each other. Okay, let's see, Rabbi Miller, if we can get some responses here. What elements does the Midrashic text add to our understanding of what Moses experienced as we read in the Bible? And don't be reticent. You are now the newcomers in Midrash. We're in a class here, and the teacher is saying you got to respond. Even something as simple, for example, as the first lines. It says, Moses vayar, he saw. What did he see? Their burdens. And what did he do? He cried, hu bocheh. The words add to the power of this moment in Moses' life. He weeps for his brothers and sisters who are undergoing persecution, right? What else?
A comment came in wondering, they noticed the fact that in passage 1, Moses goes out to his brothers, not to strangers oppressed by Egypt, but to what's listed as his brothers. and he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew of his brothers. Are we reacting to whom we show our compassion only to those we count as brothers?
It's a great question, and that's a question we're going to bring up during this hour plus that we're going to have. What is our obligation to people who are not Jewish? To what extent does social action impel us to respond to all human beings? And on some level, you even begin to see it in this passage. It says in the middle of the passage that he has to act out of a sense of brotherhood with them, minhag achim. But I think that's writ large. It talks about the nature of his relationship with the people. It's almost as if to say that the people outside, and I include non-Jews in this as well, the people outside who are created in God's image, he has to relate to them as if he's flesh and blood. They are a part of him, and that's part of the impulsion to respond to them and their needs, if you will. What else in the middle of the passage, what does it focus on here? What does it add? What does he do as he responds?
So one other person wrote in noticing that Moses has a great deal of empathy, setting aside his own tasks to take care of the people.
Yeah, and that certainly is our challenge. How do we set aside all of the tasks that we're facing in our own life situations and find the time to respond to others? You know, it's so easy to say, I'm so overwhelmed with everything that I have, and I'm one of the people say that all the time. How can I do any more than I'm doing, if you will? Sure. But what does Moses do in the middle of the passage? He sees every single individual as an individual, the burdens of the strong and the burdens of the poor, if you will, the burdens placed on men and the burdens placed on women. He understands that social action is really focused on every single individual. When we talk social action, it is in our generalized commitment to help humanity, if you will. We have to see the faces of individual people in need. And in seeing their faces, that's the impulsion to reach out and to touch them as well. Anything else that anyone wants to add? Go ahead.
Norman, we have a couple people writing in questions and a couple people trying to raise their hands. So I know you love interacting with people, so we're going to allow them to talk and see if we can get a little bit of interaction here this way as well.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm going to call on David Citron to add to this. David, you just have to unmute. You had your hand up.
Okay. Question I had, the way I read this passage, you don't know another person's burden unless you walk in their shoes. By moving the burdens from men to women, old to young, you get an appreciation of what the other person is bearing.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I'm really touched by your comment, and that is to understand the uniqueness of the burdens of each person. Until you, on some level, are engaged, then you really don't understand it until you yourself are experiencing it. A great comment and a great insightful comment.
We have another one here from Ann Versano. Ann, if you unmute, you want to add to the commentary?
It's really Sam. Hold on.
No, it's Ann. Her voice just got husky. I couldn't help but sense from the passage that Moses or God was not impressed with the likelihood that the people would take up the message of charity or protection of their fellow person, whether Jew or non-Jew. But in the case of slavery, I guess it's mostly Jew. Which reminds me of the tenor of today's politics. But because of that, he decides to call upon Moses to be his conduit. And I sense that it's because he just doesn't trust that the people will readily accept the lesson from his teachings.
Yeah, I think you're right on some level. I think it always is much more powerful and successful if a human being on some level embodies the very qualities that in this case God wants to see in humanity writ large. And therefore, in going out, it's not only a matter of responding to the people's needs, we embody the values that underpin that going out, that in the ultimate too is communicated to people as well. We become the models in a certain kind of way. So I think we can model for others when we respond to, other human beings in need. I want to add one final comment, and then we'll go on to the next passage. I know I'm going to be rushing through. We don't have to cover all the passages, but one last piece. On the bottom of the passage, right, it says that God saw Moses turn aside, lasur min haderech, to turn off the beaten path, to turn aside in order to see the people who are enslaved. That's actually quoting a verse that deals with the giving of the time that Moses was on Horeb and saw the burning bush. When Moses asur min haderech, when he left the beaten path and actually saw the bush burning. So the rabbis come along and say, what does it mean to turn aside to see something? And in the Midrash, it gives three possible responses. In what way did Moses turn aside? He ran towards the burning bush, or he ran towards the people when they were suffering. The second response was that he took a couple of steps towards the burning bush in order to see its presence. Or here he took a couple of steps towards the taskmaster who was beating the slave. The third Midrash is so wonderful and beautiful. It says all he did was turn his head to the right in order to see it, if you will. All we have to do is avert our eyes to the path that we walk on every single day. And if we could avert our eyes to the left or to the right, we will see then the reality of life outside of our own limited life situation. If one turns one's head to the side, not only can you see the taskmaster beating the slave and you have to intervene, but as a result of that, what happens? You really see God's presence in terms of the golden calf. By injecting ourselves in the situation of helping the slave, he really sees the essence of what God is in the universe. It's really beautiful from the point of view of Midrash. Okay, we're going to go on to passage number 3. And passage number 3 is a kind of takeoff on this passage in the sense that if we think that the rabbis are only focused on Moses' relationship with the Israelites, and we're going to respond to the issue of our response to non-Jews. If our obligation only impels us to respond to Jews who are in need, right? The rabbis in the Midrash want to talk about the fact that our responsibility is much broader. Our responsibility is to every human being who's created in God's image. And this passage is so utterly crucial. And I have to tell you, this is my favorite passage in all of Midrash, but you shouldn't believe me because I say that about a lot of different passages. Depends on what I'm teaching that day. It spins on a verse from Leviticus chapter 19, which we read on Yom Kippur, the holiness code, right? Kadoshim to you. And it spins on that verse that everyone knows, V'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha, love your neighbors yourself. This passage in Sifra, which is a 3rd century Midrash, asks the simple question, what is the greatest principle in Judaism? And there's a debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ben Azai. Ben Azai, a younger contemporary of Akiva, not as important. And Akiva says the greatest principle in the Torah is love your neighbor as yourself. In Hebrew, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. We know full well that other religions have embraced this verse in terms of their perception of what we're called upon to do. In fact, in Christianity, it's listed in the Gospels as one of the 2 primary statements in the Bible. It comes after the Shema, if you will, in the Gospel literature. So here's Akiva saying the greatest principle is love your neighbor as yourself. There's a problem. The problem is the word in Hebrew for neighbor is re'echa. And re'echa doesn't necessarily mean neighbor in this larger passage, which you don't see. The words that are parallel to re'echa in this passage in Leviticus are the words achicha, your brother or your brother and sisters, b'nei amecha, the people of your people, the people of your nation. they are on some level very particularistic, if you will, right? Re'echa is not just neighbor general, but in the biblical text, in Leviticus 19, it means your fellow Israelite in a direct kind of way. It's very, very particular. So as a result of that, Ben Azai comes along and says, the verse in Leviticus is too particular. It's only geared to Israelites and Jews. Ben Azai says there's another verse, which is the primary verse in rabbinic literature. And what's that verse he picks? It's wonderful. Take a look. Genesis 5:1. Genesis 5:1 says, Ze Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of humankind. B'yom baro Elohim Adam, on the day that God created human beings. B'demut Elohim asa oto. God created human beings in the divine image. And Ben Azai says that text, which talks about all human beings created in God's image, is the primary principle of the entire Torah. Ben Azai, as he demurs, reaches out to all of us and tells us that all people created in the divine image implies that we have a responsibility to all people, Jews and non-Jews alike. It's such a powerful passage, and I would urge you to think about it and to make it your own, because I think it's the signature of a broader social action agenda, if you will. Okay? So, passage number 4 is in part, and in fact it is, a takeoff and a kind of midrash on what we just read, on Leviticus 19:18, and on a takeoff on Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of humankind. Take a look at just this little passage. I would skip the word from line 3 to line 4, where it says Rabbi Akiva, up to the word hence at the end of line 4. That's there inappropriately. It's not in the manuscripts. Just focus on what Ben Azai says, and then the last 3 lines. Take a look at it and tell me what you think this midrash adds to the quotation of Ben Azai of this is the book of the generations of humankind, of Adam. What's the additive here that extends what Ben Azai is saying? Just take a look, read those few lines, and then tell me what you think. What's added here by this drash? And obviously you should take a look at the last couple of lines. Okay, your responses. What do you think the last couple of lines add here to that whole previous discussion in Leviticus and on Genesis 5? Remember what Genesis 5 said. This is the book of the generations of humankind on the day that God created human beings. God created human beings, what? In the likeness of God, but B'demut Elohim. What's added here?
A couple have written in to note that it combines here the idea of when you shame a person, you're bringing dishonor to God as well.
Very important point, right? Since every single human being, right, is created in the divine image. And again, we can then spend an hour on what does that mean and how do we define God, and all of that's important here. But I, for one, think that when I talk about God, I talk about the essence of the divine in each of us that impels us to our higher self. So when we somehow shame another human being, what are we really affecting in the world? We're affecting the divine presence. Translated theologically for me, when we diminish someone, we diminish that divine essence in that person, right? Just so utterly powerful. Our actions vis-a-vis other human beings can either enhance the divine presence in the world, bring it out of those other human beings, or it can diminish the divine presence. And I would submit to you, this is even a definition of sinning. What does it mean to sin? we diminish the divine presence in us, if you will. So when we do not respond to other human beings in need, if you will, what we're really doing is diminishing the perception that there is a power in the universe that makes for wholeness. So that's one powerful statement. Let's get one more. If there's one more I want to add, if not, I'll add one. Rabbi Miller, what
We
else?
have a comment that's going to come in. Hold on one second. David Citron.
I look at it a little bit differently. If you shame someone else, you also are bringing not only shame upon God, but you're bringing shame upon yourself. It is a reflection of yourself, how you treat others.
Absolutely, but I think it coheres with what I said, and that is when we don't act out of the highest in us by responding to people in need, we reduce on some level that divine in us. So the impactfulness absolutely is joined here. I was going to add one other thing in this passage. This is such a human reaction. Listen to the lines. What does it say here? That when I suffer, if I'm put to shame, when I suffer, right? Why should I care about anybody else? I have my own problems to worry about, right? When I'm in a bad way, I don't have the wherewithal to respond to someone else. It is such a human response. We all suffer in a certain kind of way, but that doesn't obviate our need to be able to reach out to. We can't use that as an excuse. Not only am I too busy and I'm tired, but I have my own problems. Those are yes, they are primary, but in a secondary way, we still have that obligation to reach out to others. This is just a lovely little addition to the text. Okay, we're going to go to passage 5. And 5 has, I think, 2 pages. I don't know if you put it together, Rabbi Miller. It's a simple passage. It's really lovely. The first part of it, which we have here, is hold on. That God prays, right? It's lovely that God actually utters prayers. So the question becomes, what does God actually pray? If you have the second page, can we put it up? Good. Take a look at it. What is God's prayer? If God could pray, how would God model prayer for us? What is the essence of God's prayer? Take a look. 1 minute, 2 minutes, read it, and then respond. And the answer obviously is pretty obvious here, right? What is the essence of God's prayer that becomes the model for human prayer, if you will? Rabbi Miller, anybody?
I see Lydia Bond. Hold on. Lydia, if you're on mute.
Mercy is the most important attribute of all the attributes given to us by God, especially including vengeance and other things, because as we ask God to forgive us our sins, we should also try to be merciful to other people.
Yeah, clearly that mercy is the hallmark of the essence of God that then carries over to us. In Hebrew, rachamim, right? Rachamim. And here it says, may mercy, may rachamim trump all of my other attributes, says God, even the attribute of justice. When we think justice is so essential to human life as it is not the end all and be all. We have to also be merciful, even to those who can harm us, because we, by our mercy towards them, can bring them to greater wholeness. It is such a powerful notion that when we walk in God's ways, when we emulate God, what we're doing in essence is primarily emulating God's rachamim to other human beings. I would even say first to ourselves, have rachamim on ourselves when we when we are less than who we are, embrace ourselves with love, even though we fall short. And out of that, we then have the ability to embrace other people when they fall short. And it has tremendous implications, even to our justice system today, because people talk about two kinds of justice: retributive justice and restorative justice. Retributive justice, retribution, is if someone sins or if someone breaks the law, they have to be punished. But restorative justice says there's rachamim in the world. We should even relate to those who can hurt us as human beings created in the divine image, who, as we do, have the propensity sometimes to hurt others. But by relating to them with rachamim, it's our hope that we could bring them to greater wholeness. That notion of rachamim here is the signature to social action. When we are able to open our eyes to people around us who are suffering and needy, right? The impulse to respond to them is the rachmanut, the rachamim that we have, that ultimately says we have to embrace them and give to them and help them, enable them to become more whole, if you will. Just so utterly wonderful. Thinking of it especially as God's prayer for humanity, God embracing human beings who do sin, and yet God embraces us, if you will.
So a question has come in: how do you reconcile that teaching with the elements of reward and punishment, of seeing God's anger and punishment for the people that appear so often in sacred texts?
Yeah, I think this is the balance to it. In other words, I think there is reward and punishment. I think people who do sin, or people who do commit crimes, have to be punished. That's one way of, in a sense, balancing, their action vis-a-vis their impact on society and on other human beings and all the rest. But yet still, essentially, even with that, there's the notion of how do you relate to someone who hurts you? Someone who's, done an injustice to you. How do you relate to that person? And how, by sharing yourself with that person, if it's possible, you can have an impact upon that person. And restorative justice goes through a great deal of effort to talk about trying to set up conversation between the one who is hurt and the one who is hurting others, to be able to share their life story together, to be able to appreciate each other more, and through that appreciation, to be restorative in terms of both the hurt that was perpetrated on the person who was hurt, and to restore the person who did the hurting to a greater sense of him or herself. So, on some level of balance, if you will.
So picking up on that restorative justice, I think you touched on this, but a couple of questions have come in, putting these two texts together, Rabbi Cohen, wondering, so if someone does something despicable, does something that causes pain, clearly you can't remain silent, but are you only limited to demeaning the action? Because if you shame the perpetrator, that somehow shames God.
Well, I think that the shaming piece does come in here, and that is, it responds to the question of how do we respond to someone who perpetrates hurt on someone else, right? And in one way it is, we have to respond, we have to call it out, we have to name it, if you will, and all the rest. And sometimes we don't have any ability to go beyond that. We're humans, sometimes we can't. But then the second possible stage is, how do we continue to relate to that person if it's at all possible? What's the goal of that relationship as it continues, and what possibly can we achieve by it? And I submit to you as something we should think about, because it happens almost every day in our own lives. Someone says something to us. How do we respond to that person in order to what? Not simply call that person out, but bring in our relationship with that person, bring that person to greater wholeness. I mean, I think it's a challenge every single day. But let's go on, because the time is fleeting. I want to go to passage number 6. We've been rather general in terms of what our responsibility is to people outside of us. We have a responsibility to respond to those outside of us, especially those who are suffering, those who are in a bad way. But what about some exemplary actions to give us a sense of what the tradition talks about, right? So on passage number 6, if we could put it up. Oh, you already beat me to it, Rabbi Miller, you're fast. Passage from the Talmud. It says one should follow the attributes of the Holy One, which is exactly what we just did in terms of Rachamim. And where does that lead us? Just as God clothes the naked, read the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden when they were about to leave. In chapter 3, God put upon them skins from animals to protect them in the world outside the garden. So too, we have to cover the naked. And I think you should read it much more generally. We have a responsibility to people who suffer in this world, the poor and the indigenous, and we need to respond to other human beings. But beyond that, right? Just as God, what? As God visits the sick, so too, and when did God visit the sick? In the story of Abraham, again, in chapter 18, after his circumcision, and was sitting in the heat of the day in his tent, God appeared to him in the guise of the angels. So too, we have to visit the sick. Just as God does what? Just as God heals those who are in mourning, if you will, who consoles the mourner. When did God console the mourner? God consoled Isaac when Abraham died in Genesis 25 by giving him a blessing. And the rabbis say it's a blessing of those in mourning so that he would be able to come back to his former self. Just as God reaches out to those in mourning, so too shall we. And finally, just as God buries the dead, God buried Moses in chapter 34, we should have the zechut of burying the dead as well and fulfill that Midrash. So what's being said here? It has two different kinds of sets of Midrash, of infirmities, if you will, of suffering, if you will, right? All those that are particular, and have an aspect of ritual attached to it, if you will, but it forces us to go deeper than just the perfunctory ritual, right? Those who are sick, we should visit the sick, but we're reaching out and extending a hand, and by embracing their hand, we make them stronger and they make us stronger in dealing with it. Those who reach out to mourners and give them comfort, it helps us in terms of how we react to people who are suffering in our own lives. And of course, in terms of burial, not only are we performing a ritual, if you will, that's very important. This is the last ritual that we can perform for a human being on this earth. And that's why we throw shovels of the ground, of dirt into the coffin, because we're doing it, if you will, but rather also ways of comforting ourselves for our own loss. So there are two pieces here. When we reach out to others, it not only helps out other people in need, especially the poor and the indigent, but it helps us gain a greater sense of ourselves and what we're capable of doing and what's important in our lives. And why do we reach out to every single human being, be they the indigent and poor and the needy and the sick and the why? Because basically what is being said is we have to be willing to reach out to each person in this world who is created in God's image, who has an essence of the divine in them. It's a really beautiful, beautiful passage. We'll just take a second as you're thinking about it. Let me mention one other thing, and maybe you want to respond to this. If we go through the passage in Sota here, and we go through chronologically in terms of the applications, what do we see? It's applied to Adam, right? In God providing him with the clothing. It's applied to Abraham, it's applied to Isaac, and it's applied to Moses. What you have to do when you read a rabbinic text is say, is it happenstance that the text is edited in this way? What we have here is the journey of the Jewish people from the Garden of Eden to Moses, which represents Torah, that will get us back, if we observe it, to the Garden of Eden. It's talking about the generations of the Jewish people. So what it's really saying here is that in the generations of that we experience as human beings, in the situations that we experience, we have the opportunity to respond to people in need in a variety of different ways, and is part and parcel of our life as Jews. Our whole life as Jews is in part caught up in the notion of our responsibility to respond to those around us. It's a great example of kind of editing of a rabbinic text to make its point even stronger. So I'll just take a second. If you think about passage 6 anything that you want to add to it just quickly. We'll take one or two quick comments because I want to go on to passage number 7 and 8.
One
and 9.
comment already came in, an observation that compassion appears to be synonymous with God's attributes.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we're going to see it in almost any one of the texts. Anything else, Rabbi Miller? If not, we're going to go on.
That one came in already, so if you want to move on, we can move on.
Let's move on. Let's take a look at chapter 7, which we're going to post on the board. And I have 2 questions that I want you to think about. First of all, it comes from Mishnah Sanhedrin. You know, Mishnah, the earliest book of rabbinic law, end of the 2nd century, and it comes from a tractate on Sanhedrin, which is law that pertains to how a court functions. All right. The passage starts out with the quoting the text of Cain and Abel, Genesis chapter 4, the blood of your brother. Kol demei achicha tzoakim alai min ha'adama. All the blood of your brother cries out to me from the ground. And the translation here is correct when it says the bloods of your brother, because the word for blood in Hebrew here is damei, damim, it's plural. All the bloods of your brother cry out from the ground, right? In the second half of the passage, it changes the tonality of it. It talks about something different. If you take a look at the second half of the passage, it says when you harm a single person, when you harm a single person, is as if you impact upon the entire world. When you create a single life, you create the entire world. So there are 2 separate parts to it. How does the text hold together here? First, what is the implication of the bloods of your brother? When God says to Cain, after he kills Abel, the bloods of your brother are crying out to me from the ground. What's the power here of that verse? And secondly, the issue of why this is set in Sanhedrin, in court law, in the law that pertains to how courts judge. Why is it there? It's a narrative piece that talks about the value. Why is it in the realm of law that pertains to the court? So take a look at it very quickly. It's only about 4 lines. Talk to me about that phrase from the bloods of your brother cry out to me from the ground, and why that is important. And second of all, why is it placed here in the court system?
So one response came in saying we're all connected, that if we harm one, we harm all.
Yeah, absolutely. But when we say harm all, the implication is what? That we harm all human beings. But look at how it's applied in the beginning. The bloods of your brother, or the blood of your brother, is cast over the trees and the stones. Now, I think that's meant figuratively, but what is it really saying? It's really saying that let's go beyond the notion of thinking about social action as our response to human beings, but we have an obligation to what? To the world around us, to nature, the impact of our actions on the world around us and on nature. And if there's anything that is current, in our vocabulary today, it's exactly that. What are we doing vis-a-vis the world around us, right? We understand that that on every TV show that you can watch today, we see Bill Gates in his new book telling us that by 2050, hopefully we'll do something meaningful in terms of our environment. This text is talking about environment. What we do as human beings impacts upon the world around us, if you will. So I would just broaden the comment, if you will. What else do we have? Keep on going.
A couple people have asked. They make that they must have heard this text or seen it, but they're thinking about this in relationship to capital punishment and giving this message before thinking about taking the life of another.
Yeah, that's very important, and it actually answers the second question that I had. And that is, it's said here in Sanhedrin, because you're going to be amazed, that this text was actually read, according to the rabbis, when the judges of that Sanhedrin put together a court for a capital case. When witnesses came to testify in a capital case, they read this verse as if to say, what we do vis-a-vis one human being has an impact upon the entire world, upon other human beings. So when we think in terms of Cain and Abel, what's the impact on Cain and Abel? By killing Abel, what's the ultimate impact? All the generations that could have come from Abel is immediately cut off. So our impact when we harm somebody is much broader than the immediacy of the people involved. And that's what the rabbis were saying in the court case. By actually taking someone's life in a capital case, we impact on the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that will emanate from that person. And what was the upshot from a rabbinic point of view? The rabbis say, in 70 years, there was never one capital case that came to fruition. No one's life was ever taken in a capital case. It's an amazing statement in and of itself, if you will, right? And our actions vis-a-vis another human being impact upon the world around us, upon nature. The spilling of the blood has an impact upon nature around us. Powerful stuff. Anything else that we'll take one more if it's there.
Sure. We'll call on Sam again.
Go ahead, Sam, if you're there.
Sam and Ann, you had your hand up?
If not,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. To me, my reading of the beginning of that paragraph is an expression of God's horror and disappointment at the human beings that he created in terms of the potential for their actions towards evil. It's not supposed to be words that were coming out of someone else's mouth, but God's mouth. And I think that it was a cause for a pause in God's thinking about what he had wrought. And
yes.
And
yeah, and as a matter of fact, there's loads of Midrashim that talk about, especially about this event, where the angels in God, who are kind of the subsidiaries of God, divine subsidiaries of God, are arguing with God about the creation. Why did you create the human being? Right? Was the human being worthy of being created? Just look what they have the propensity for, what the capability of doing. But nevertheless, there's the notion of human beings can change, and a lot depends upon how we relate to those human beings to give them that opportunity to change. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit and move on to passage number 10, if you will. So let's take a look at that. Put it up from Kohelet Rabbah. Kohelet is Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes Rabbah is one of the Rabbah Midrashim, as we saw, Shemot Rabbah, Exodus Rabbah. And it spins on a verse from chapter 7, which brings us to the broadening of our responsibilities to the outside world vis-a-vis nature. So look at the text, right? Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which that person has made crooked. This is a statement about how we impact upon nature around us, upon the world around us, upon the environment around. Once we impact negatively on the environment, is it ever possible to make it straight, to make it whole again, if you will, right? Look what it says in the text, so beautiful. God takes Adam by the hand and leads him around the Garden of Eden, taking a look at all the trees, and he says to him, behold my works, how beautiful and commendable they are. All that I have created for your sake. Pay heed that you do not corrupt and destroy the universe. For if you do, there is no one to repair it after you. So the question is Bill Gates's projection of 2050 correct? That we can repair the damage we've done to the universe by 2050. What is it really saying here in that story? There's no one after you to repair it. What is the Midrash saying to us here? I want a response from somebody. What is the Midrash saying? That's no one after us who can repair it.
So one person came in to ask if God relinquishes power when giving man freedom of action. Let's see, we have another hand up. I'm going to call on Edith to unmute.
I'd like to say, I think that after all this damage is done and we don't take care of things, there won't be anybody here in the universe. It'll be nothing. That's
Yeah, and I think that the issue of is when human beings damage the universe, do we reach a tipping point? And I think it's an important comment vis-a-vis Gates and others who talk about environmental protection and everything. Do we reach a point where it can't be returned, if you will, where the environment can't be corrected in a kind of way, where we can't fulfill that first responsibility God gave us in the garden? Remember, the first commandment to humanity, God placed Adam and Eve in the garden. Vaynichehu b'gan Eden. What did it say? To do what? Lo'ovda la'avot, to work it, and to l'shomra, l'shmor, and to what? Protect it, preserve it. If that's the first commandment that we're giving in a certain kind of way, if you will, how can we fulfill that if we reach the tipping point where we can never, ever reclaim the damage that's been done? It's just a clarion cry for us to talk about our responsibilities to the universe around us, and at what point can we retrieve the damage that we've done? Okay, passage number 11.
Well, one other comment came in. I think it's also important.
Let's get it. Go
From
ahead.
Stephen Valerie Stewart, noting that if we destroy the world, it will also include our destruction as a consequence.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as we destroy the world, we destroy the food source, we destroyed everything, if you will. And, you know, the interesting thing of all is that you compare that to Noah's flood in a certain kind of way. You know, when you destroy the entire world, is it impossible to retrieve it and with the flood in a certain kind of way, the retrieving aspect of it is dependent upon two things: God's continuing existence, irrespective of what's happened in the world, because God as a presence in us enables us to retrieve the world, and the ongoing life of a set of human beings that still have the capacity to rebuild the world itself. So if we ourselves are damaged by the damage that we do, we ourselves are not in a position to ever restore the world itself. Take a look at passage number 11, another passage from the Talmud, if you will. Listen to what it says. And with this passage and the last passage last text passage that I want to share with you, these are the two key passages from my point of view in terms of social action, reaching a broader network of people. Okay, these are crucial. So what does this passage say? That we should allow non-Jews to do what? To glean from our fields, to pick up the forgotten sheaves, to take the produce from the corners of the field, just as an Israelite could do that in their fields. Non-Jews should be able, we should be in a position to help those and sustain those who are needy by actually gleaning from our fields. And so what is the deduction from that? What does it say? It says, not only should we allow them to come in and glean from our fields, because it will account as the ways of peace, but the sages say in the second half of the passage, what should we do? We should sustain the poor of the Gentiles along with the poor of the Jews. We should visit the sick of the Gentiles with the sick of the Jews. We should bury the dead of the Gentiles with Jews who have died. And all of this, here's the rationale that social action is given by the rabbi. All of this, and in Hebrew it says, Mipnei darchei shalom, for the sake of the ways of peace. And the question is left with us, and this is crucial for us to think about, and we're going to get one more passage in a second. What does it mean, Mipnei darchei shalom? What does it mean as a rationale for social action of because of the ways of peace? Why? What's the impulse here? Much of the tradition on some level says, just as the last line in this passage, what does it say? This is done on account of the ways of peace to foster peaceful relations between Jews and Gentiles. We, a minority who live in majority cultures, want to reach out to Gentiles and embrace them by helping them and bringing them in and supporting them, because we want to make peace with them. We want to live in a peaceful world with them so they don't beat on us and kill us. It's for the sake of establishing peace with the Gentiles, who are the majority culture. And the rabbis are writing this in the 2nd, 3rd century, having experienced the destruction of the temple under the Romans. But what does the tradition say over the next 1800 years? So take a look at passage 11b, which is the concomitant to this, where Maimonides, 800 years later, at the end of the 12th century, says, this is what we have to do for non-Jews, right? Levaker cholim, to visit their sick, to bury their dead, right, along with ours, to sustain non-Jewish poor, to reach out to them. Why? B'nei darchei shalom, the same rationale, because of the ways of peace. But what does Maimonides do? Maimonides adds 2 biblical proof texts, 2 texts from the Bible that changes that early notion of we're doing it for the sake of keeping peace with the majority culture, if you will. One of the 2 passages that explain what the rationale for social action is, passage number 1, Psalm 145. You know it because it's part of the Ashrei, which we say every day, right? Tov Adonai lakol v'racha, here's our word, rachamim, rachamav al kol ma'asav. God is good to all, and God's mercies, here we go then, right, rachamim, are upon whom? Every single element of creation, not just Jews. Kol hama'asim, everything that God created is worthy of our rachmanut, our rachamim. And even better, the last proof text, which is also taken from a verse we know from the liturgy, the Torah's service in the liturgy, right? Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. What does it say? Drachecha darchei noam, talking about the Torah from the book of Proverbs. Its ways are darchei noam, ways of pleasantness, v'chol netivoteha shalom, and all its paths are shalom, peace. And the question is, what does that add to that rationale of we do it only to make peace, with non-Jews? And that's a crucial element here is what? We do it so that we can come to shalom. And shalom is not just peaceful relations. We want to create shalom writ large. Shalom being what? Shleimut, wholeness. We observe Torah. We embody Torah. We represent what Torah is. And in so doing, what do we represent? The possibility of achieving wholeness in the world. That's what Torah brings us to. And so the ultimate point here is about social action. We do it because when we reach out to someone else in the world or to nature, we take one step to bringing the world to fruition, if you will, to making it whole, to making people whole. Just really powerful stuff. Every small act vis-a-vis another human being, when we go and we contribute money to help people who are in need and are starving, when we bring clothing, whatever it might be, visiting people who are needy, that act alone is one step to bringing the world to wholeness. By embodying and living Torah, we bring shalom, shleimut. And writers from Maimonides on have talked about the fact that this whole issue of social action is all about bringing greater wholeness to the world. And now I'm going to give you the gift of today, the gift that will celebrate the 10th anniversary of 2 wonderful leaders of our congregation here, right? This is our gift. Take a look at the last passage. It's passage number 12. And I choose it purposefully because it's not a liberal writer. No, next one, if you have it, it's the Soloveitchik piece. Good. I'm particularly skipping over the previous passage, which was written by Arthur Waskow, a liberal Jew, and there are many, many passages of Reform writers who talk about the whole issue of social. We talk about it all the time. But I specifically wanted to show you that there are traditional Jewish scholars and rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, who talk about social action as being systemically tied to who we are as Jews. Listen to this quote from Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rav, Harav, the head of, for many, many years, of the of Yeshiva University. the leading light of orthodoxy. Listen to what he writes in his Man of Faith in the Modern World. And I would commit this book to you. It's published in 2 volumes today in a new edition. You can get it on Amazon. Listen to what he writes. The modern Jew is entangled in the activities of the Gentile society in numerous ways, economically, politically, culturally, on some levels, socially. We share in the universal experience. The problems of humanity, war and peace, political stability or anarchy, morality and permissiveness, famine, epidemics, tell us about it, pollution, transcend the boundaries of ethnic groups. A stricken environment, both physical and ideological, can wreak havoc upon all groups. It is our duty, says Soloveitchik, as human beings and as Jews, to contribute our energies and creativity to do what? To alleviate the pressing needs and anguish of humankind and contribute to their welfare. That, in essence, is a traditional rabbi who understands the thrust of the Jewish tradition. Tikkun olam, social action, is all about God's demand of us that when we look at other human beings and we look at the world around us, we have an essential responsibility to each element of society, which embodies God's presence, if you will. This is what Judaism, my friends, demand of us. This is what is demanded of every Jewish organization, and everything that you do here at Temple Shalom fits into this ideological modality of our fulfilling our responsibilities as human beings created in God's image. So I thank you. I thank you for coming along with us. I thank you for the opportunity to share texts that I love and to be with you, and especially to be with Rabbi Miller and Cantor Azu, and to all of you on this occasion of celebrating their wonderful anniversary. You couldn't be blessed by 2 more generous, giving, powerful models of what Judaism stands for than your rabbi and your Cantor, and your assistant rabbi too.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Cohen. It's been brilliant. I want to go back. We have a bunch of questions came in about a text that people are wrestling with. They're putting together what you've been teaching them. They're listening.
Right.
And they're really wrestling with the idea of why did they go to Mignei Darchei Shalom? Why did they go to the idea of because of the way of peace? And why didn't they instead go to the text you showed us earlier? These are the generations of man that were created B'Tselem Elohim. Why the difference of arguing for the sake of peace and not doing it because it's the right thing to do for others?
Yeah. First of all, I would agree with it. I think that text in Genesis 5:1 is one that rings through everything that we talked about, and is one that we have to hold on to. And had they say, right, Mipnei Tselem Elohim, it would have been very, very powerful. I think on some level that the notion of Mipnei Darchei Shalom was so prevalent in the early generations in the context of persecution, whether it be in the context of persecution under Christians in the early centuries of the first millennium, or in the Islamic context, whether it be in the Middle Ages in Europe, in the context of Christianity, even through the modern period, in all of those contexts in which we suffered as Jews. That Mipnei Shalom resonated as a theme word in terms of the totality of their being. If only we could achieve and experience shalom, but translating it in the narrow sense of peacefulness, if you will, we can rest well tonight when we go to sleep and not be afraid, is to limit the power of the word. And that limitation comes out when you look at that phrase in the medieval into the modern period. When they say Mipnei Darchei Shalom, they're not just meaning we hope that they won't beat on us. We'll live in a peaceful world. It becomes more than that. And that's why I was playing on the word shalom and shlemut. It's not just peace, but it's wholeness. This will bring us and the world to wholeness again. So they missed an opportunity, but now they have to explain to us what shalom means in its essence that makes it more appropriate.
A beautiful teaching. Do you want to take a couple more questions?
We'll take some more. Sure. I'm not in a rush.
All right.
Please.
We have time for just 2 quick things. I'm going to call on 2 people who have their hands up. I'm going to ask you, when I call on you, just ask a question. We're going to refrain from making statements and just ask a quick question so we can get Rabbi Cohen to respond. first to Barbara Shapira. You'll unmute. Barbara, you had your hand up. All right, we'll go to first to David Citron, and Barbara, if you can unmute, we'll get you next. Go ahead, David. Quick question.
Quick question. Why they say the Jews and the Gentiles should be buried together? Why is every cemetery I've gone to has a Jewish section separate from the Gentile section?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think the text is really saying they should be buried together. It went out of its way to say we're responsible for helping to bury the dead if there's no one else to bury them. So I don't think they were necessarily saying that Jews and Gentiles should be together. However, I think we can respond and say the essence of the comment is the responsibility of burial, if you will, applies to all human beings, not just to Jewish folk, if you will. And from that point of view, there's the synonymity between the two.
Fantastic. Rabbi Cohen, thank you so much for the gift of your Torah, of your time, and for inspiring us and seeing how our texts really shape who we are and how it is that we interact with the world around us. Particularly, I love that last text from Soloveitchik showing us this is not just one piece of Judaism. This is across the Jewish world, this value of repairing our world, of doing the sacred work of Tikkun Olam b'Malchut Shaddai, preparing the world for all of God's kingdom. Thank you as my teacher, as my mentor, as my friend. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to have you here as part of this series.
It's so wonderful for me to be with you and sharing and being with the entire congregation. I'm just sorry that I couldn't see your faces and we couldn't talk back and forth, but maybe we'll have that opportunity in the future. Look forward to coming down to Naples and actually seeing all of you in person.
It would be our delight to have you down here. And I know your dear friends, Meryl and Paula, would love to have you down here.
Absolutely.
I see
I'm so
Paula's
glad
been with us throughout this. They've been with us throughout this presentation. For all those who are joining us, this has been the third part of our phenomenal scholar series this year as we celebrate our decade of distinction. A reminder that our next one will be with Dr. Gary Zola. Get that right for you. Dr. Gary Zola, who will be speaking to us next week on American Judaism. He's a phenomenal historian. That will be next week on Thursday evening. We look forward to having Dr. Zola as the next part of our scholar series. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. Thank you to all who are joining us, and thank you for being a part of our phenomenal community. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Hello, Michelle.